Hi, I'm Suzanne, and this is Not Really Strangers, the podcast where we explore just how connected the refugee experience is to our everyday lives and to the social issues that matter most to us. Thanks for joining us for another conversation with a brand new guest, here to share the story of how they came to realize that their story and the refugee story were intertwined. By the end of this episode, you'll see that in this global community, the distance between us is often much shorter than we think. Let's dive in. Colin, it's wonderful to see you. I know our audience can't see you. They're just going to hear us having this conversation, but I appreciate your making the time. I appreciate, as of January of this year, of 2025, you've joined the board of directors at USA for UNHCR, connected to us by a longtime terrific board member, Eric Sprunk. So we have good people in common. And you are joining a podcast called Not Really Strangers. And we're going to get into the theme of the podcast a little bit later. But we're going to start off with some really just kind of basics on the logistics and kind of who you are front. So if you're ready, I'm going to kick off.
Hey, fire away. Great to be here.
Well, let's start off with where are you dialing in from? Tell us a little bit about where you are and kind of how you came to join the USA for UNHCR journey.
Well, I'm dialing in from Annapolis down in Maryland. I've been here about 8 years. And prior to that, I'd spent many years living and working in Asia, and actually I'd been in Hong Kong for kind of 12, 15 years. So I'd spent a lot of my life in that part of the world. So I'm down here in Maryland, and I ended up being introduced through UNHCR through Eric. I mean, although, this was something that, the refugee crisis was something that I was made aware of a few years ago when I did a simulation event in Hong Kong, which for me was incredibly moving and profound. And although it was only kind of a 24-hour kind of experience of a simulation event, the level of disorientation that I felt and the way in which it made me reflect upon, the issues that we're dealing with was something which has stuck with me since. And so when Eric called, it was kind of hell yes.
Awesome. Well, you mentioned a few places in there, Annapolis and Hong Kong. Where do you call home? Like where?
That's wherever I lay my hat is kind of what I'd say. As you can probably tell, I'm originally from England. Grew up in a little city called Norwich, which if anybody watches the Premier League, Norwich was in and out of the Premier League in soccer for many years, but it's one of these little provincial cities that you have to want to go to. There's no real substantial reason to go there. It's kind of at the end of the road for many, but it's the end of many roads, let's put it that way. Great city though, stunning city, beautiful place to grow up. But I then moved overseas when I started my career, and then spent many years living and working in Asia. So I was in Korea for a couple of years, then I was in China in the early 90s, and then Thailand and the Philippines, and then ultimately ended up back in the UK and back to Hong Kong again. But where do I call home? I don't know. I mean, I've got two boys that live in London with my granddaughter and another grandson on the way. My daughter lives in Hong Kong, so she's in that part of the world. And my wife splits her time between Annapolis and the UK. So I kind of think I'm somewhere between the US and the UK. I've got a home here in Annapolis, and I've got a home in the UK.
But on the move, and a notion of home as a flexible place where your people are.
You have to follow your heart, don't you?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think I can be at home anywhere, but as long as I'm with people I love and want to spend time with.
Yeah, beautiful. You follow, like I do, closely the work of the UN Refugee Agency, and so you know that in terms of numbers, and we won't get too mired in these big statistics, but it's, well over 122 million people who've experienced forced displacement. I'd love to hear a little bit more about this experiential kind of bit that you did when you were in Hong Kong that maybe sort of further deepened your passion for this issue. People that are moving or forced to flee, as they call it, it's because of violence, persecution, it's conflict. And that number has doubled in the last decade, which is pretty extraordinary. Long before I became as deeply involved in this issue as I am, but still I can understand doubling in a decade, and it's a lot. One of my goals in this podcast and in our work here at USA for UNHCR is just to highlight how much overlap there is between, like I said, guests that I've interviewed who are in the restaurant and culture space, or guests that I know who are in the workforce mobility space. And you've had a long career in and out of the apparel industry on sustainability issues. So will you talk a little bit about the overlap between the refugee crisis and forced displacement, and where your professional interests have been really focused? Where do you see areas of real resonance?
I mean, I think first of all, we tend to think that the refugee crisis is something which is really, we tend to think of it. I propose a lot of us tend to think of it as a very kind of almost a Western world kind of issue. But as the UNHCR has highlighted, a lot of the refugees are hosted in low middle income kind of countries, and so it has a huge impact on a lot of those places. And to be frank with you, that's a lot of. I've spent a lot of my time from the apparel and footwear industry and from the way in which we think about global supply chains living and working in those countries. And you end up bumping into it in a much more meaningful way when you spend your time in that part of the world, because we think a lot about it. Again, we think a lot of it as a kind of as a crisis in the West, and it clearly is, because it's a global crisis, but it does impact all different parts of society. And I think one of the things that I realized, and it dawned on me, that it's not just the obvious, asylum seekers, but it's also, those people that have been displaced, and it's not necessarily political radicals. It's often, teachers and nurses, business owners, parents. It's people like you and me that are often displaced for no fault of their own. And when you start to realize that, and you realize just how long they can be stuck in this, and I will say purgatory to a degree, although we work really hard with, and UNHCR and others work really hard to kind of help address that. It's a huge issue that I don't think we necessarily reflect on. And certainly, as I said, I think the fact that I've spent some time in these other countries is important to me, and means it's important to me. I also think it's one of the things that, certainly, if I may, one of the things that I spent much of my career running supply chains. And so and a lot of our global supply chain has been built around this model of what we call comparative advantage, meaning there's a reason to be moving products to different countries in order to manufacture them, because certain countries just naturally have advantages with regards to what they can produce and what they can make. And sometimes that advantage is labor, sometimes it's raw materials, sometimes it's commodities. It can be various different things. But, one of the big challenges I think we have at the moment is with the lack of stability with regards to, things like tariffs and other geopolitical issues. It's really difficult for countries to decide how they are going to respond to these issues. And a lot of these issues really impact the people that are lower levels within society, because they're the people that are manufacturing the goods. They're the people that are often working in these factories. And so, this level of insecurity we're dealing with at the moment is something which is very real and has very real impact on individuals in the countries in across the world.
Yeah. I appreciate the, just going a little bit deeper on sort of the global supply chain piece. And of course, that UNHCR has just a massive logistics operation. So if anywhere you think about emergency response, let's remind our listeners that in an emergency response, you need all sorts of emergency equipment, core relief items, tarps, generators, basic hygiene kits. And if you're doing that at the scale of hundreds of thousands of people, if you think of the displacement that's happening in Sudan and South Sudan right now, that is sort of one example of an emergency that UNHCR has to mobilize so quickly to respond to. And you, better than many, really understand the kind of complicated supply chain and, sort of like logistics framework that has to support that sort of response.
Agreed. And, and the UNHCR, I think, published their report on the brink past couple of days, which really kind of talks to the impact of these aid cuts, and the impact that these aid cuts are having globally, with potentially another 11 million people being forced to flee, is and $1.4 billion kind of stuff put on hold. It has a huge impact, and we tend to think of it on very selfish terms, but this is messing with people's lives, and it's something which is very disconcerting. And it's a great report, by the way.
Yeah, it is a good report. We'll definitely put that in the show notes. It's just been released this morning, actually, with a press conference at the Palais des Nations in Geneva. And I also just want to sort of pick up, you mentioned, and just a reminder for the listeners that, people who are on the move really are people from every sort of stripe and walk of life. And the people that I'm most moved by are those who are teachers and healthcare workers and students. I mean, how many forcibly displaced people are students who miss a year, 2, 3, 5 of learning and are so hungry to get back into formal education, earn their degrees. It's one of UNHCR's sort of set of programs that I'm just so moved by, and have met so many refugee leaders who came out of, a scholarship program for tertiary education, got to finish a university degree, and sort of really don't see that their life could have had the potential and purpose that it has if not for that grounding in education. So these are really, sort of average lives, if you will, that are totally disrupted. And so I appreciate you kind of putting an emphasis on that. So you talked a little bit about supply chain and maybe some of your, sort of industry specific kind of expertise and reflections, but pull back a little bit and tell me kind of more sort of a general set of business reflections, because, we work with corporates all across the Ciscos of the world, the UPSs of the world, the Starbucks of the world. So many corporate leaders have named UNHCR and the refugee crisis as something they want to get engaged in. I don't know, give me some other examples of where you've seen businesses make meaningful impact on this issue or on others, just to kind of help round out the listeners' understanding of what the potential is for private sector engagement.
I'm gonna go in a really odd place to begin with, but I've just been reading a book about the East India Company, of all obscure things, and the history of the East India Company and the British Raj, just because I was reflecting on the impact of empire and others. And one of the things I didn't realize was that the British East India Company was actually was a private enterprise for the first kind of 200 years of its existence, and the British Empire in India was controlled out of a small office in Leadenhall Street, I think it was, in London, with a couple of hundred people on the ground in India. And the British Raj, as from the kind of the government underlying kind of support of it, was really only kind of 1/3 of the time that it was in existence. But the reason I mention that is it just goes to show, and there's a lot of tragedies, by the way, that was all tied into that. And so we don't need to go anywhere near that, because that's why I was trying to read it to understand it. But the reason I highlight it is the fact that it just goes to show that, the impact on business and commerce on what happens in countries and regions can be enormous. We tend to think of this as the responsibility of governments, but industry and commerce can play a huge role in trying to solve these problems. And I sometimes think in the current political climate we exist today, where, to be frank with you, there's a great deal of mistrust around politicians, the need for business to step up and fill that vacuum, the need for business leaders to step into that vacuum is something we can do. And I think a lot of the employees, and certainly in the companies that I've worked for, are really committed to trying to make this world a better place, and may often be frustrated with some of the political quagmire that we have at the moment. But the idea of trying to lean into these things as businesses, and trying to commit. And you mentioned some of the great people we have working with us at UNHCR. Can really make a meaningful difference. And I think we sometimes forget that. We think this just has to be a government problem. It doesn't have to be. Yeah. We can actually lean into it from a commercial level in a much more meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, they're at the global level. UNHCR has some extraordinary, long-term partners. I mean, IKEA has been kind of by our side in so many different geographies around the world as an emergency response and humanitarian organization, and they really see it as sort of core to their business, core to their values, core to their sense of kind of corporate philosophy in the world. It's been amazing for me, having come from other fundraising environments where corporate partners were less a significant part of our mix. It's been a lot of fun to come here and to see how those individuals and institutions come to the table looking to make change. And we recently, and the figures, again, maybe we can put some of these reports in the show notes, the contribution that refugees make to sort of the economic growth and productivity of a country, the one that is getting a lot of sort of press, if you will, are Ukrainian refugees in Poland. And it's been, sort of upwards of 3% of GDP that Ukrainian refugees are sort of infusing into the Polish economy. And if you put that at sort of like the US, it'd be like a $600 billion contribution in a year. And then we also see that when we start to really sort of curtail resettlement and sort of close borders in ways that don't allow for this sort of natural flow of people who are looking for safety and opportunity, we have at the state and federal level seen real dips. That contribution can't easily be replaced. And so I know that's not the only way to win this debate, but I'm really moved by livelihoods. I'm moved by sense of purpose and agency, and that even in refugee camps where people know they're living in very hopefully temporary sort of settings, people want to work. They want to do something. They're skilled in an area. They have an expertise. And I do feel that private sector partnerships are the ones that can really help us kind of see that potential and figure out creative ways to leverage it.
Yeah, no, I know it was, again, I completely agree. And it was, going back to that experience I went through in Hong Kong with Crossroads. I mean, part of it involved, constructing somewhere to live for 24 hours and then actually reflecting on the implications of it. And one of the things that struck me was just how long people are, and you probably, I'm sure you know the numbers, Suzanne, but then, the amount of time that people are can be in a refugee situation can be years, can be decades. I mean, and to be living in those conditions and to not be able to fulfill, what you are destined to do in a meaningful way has got to be incredibly demoralizing and creates a lot of perhaps some of the political issues we deal with today, because people are because they are stuck and not able to move forward. And to be that disorientated for that long and not have somewhere to call home, and I cannot imagine just how awful that must be, and how and I'd like to think we talk a little bit about we all contemplate how global trade is changing and geopolitics are changing, but the idea of us finding gainful and meaningful work for people is an important part of, I think, one of the things that the commercial world can do as we're helping to understand this crisis.
So, Colin, you've mentioned this Crossroads experience, the sort of experiential learning, and what drew you in many ways to this mission. Would you mind just kind of telling us sort of from the start a little bit of what that experience was, kind of minute by minute, hour by hour? It seems to have so kind of fundamentally transformed your understanding of displacement. I think the listeners would really benefit from hearing it from you directly.
I mean, I first got to hear about through the experience through some work that we were doing indirectly with this foundation called Crossroads in Hong Kong, which works with our industry and runs a similar program to the UNHCR and a gifting kind of model. And I was introduced to the team and spent some time on their campus working with them a little bit. And we were dealing with some issues at the time in Jordan with regards to the Syrian refugee crisis. And, and they invited me along together with another group of business leaders from Hong Kong to attend this simulation. And, my understanding of the issue changed profoundly after I participated within this simulation that happened. I mean, it was a 24-hour experience designed to replicate in a deeply immersive way the dislocation and the fear faced by being a refugee. And right from the moment it began, which was late in the evening, they stripped away the comfort of everyday life. We all had to change our clothes and have a different name and join a different family. And we were herded into these small, overcrowded shelters and ordered around in the dark by actors posing as armed guards and, subjected to these arbitrary rules and shouting at us in these different languages that we didn't understand. And there was no privacy and none of those things that we kind of take for granted. And, they constantly kept us on our toes and kept us alert. And we didn't know if we were safe from one moment to the next. And so it was my sense of control over who I was and what it meant to be Colin was completely evaporated. I remember one of the moments that kind of still stick with me is that we were woken up in the middle of the night by these guys posing as guards, shouting at us and told to move on immediately. And it was incredibly disorientating. And although it was a simulation, it was really frightening, and my body reacted, as if it was a real situation. My heart was pounding, and I still remember feeling incredibly uncomfortable, and even though I knew in the core that I was in a safe place, the fact that I was going through that experience just made me realize how quickly your sense of self, your sense of security, your sense of safety can be taken away. And at the end of the day, when we all went home and took showers and slept in our clean beds and ate our dinners, I realized just how incredibly fortunate that I am to be able to live that life. But there's millions of people who don't who don't have the opportunity to walk away from that, and for them, that's their reality. And that reality, and we can be for 10 years or more. And every couple of hours we would break to kind of review what we had the experience we'd just gone through, and it was all pretty well choreographed. But for me, it really brought home that this is such a huge crisis with 110, 120 million people that are going through this, and unfortunately, I think it's getting worse as opposed to getting better. And the impact of the aid cuts that we're seeing at this moment, it will have a huge impact on it. And for so many people, it is an incredibly tragic situation, and they're not able to move out of that. And that contrast of my life with theirs has something which has stayed with me, and one of the reasons why I was happy to join the UNHCR, because it's such an important mission.
What a beautiful story. Thank you. So let's go to the name of this podcast, Not Really Strangers, which I love. And I'll tell you that every individual with whom I've spoken has had their own kind of interpretation of what that means. So I'm going to ask you, what does the idea of being a stranger mean to you? What does the title of the podcast, Not Really Strangers, mean for you in this context of refugees and displacement?
I come back to the fact that this is not about the political opportunistic individuals that kind of get swept up in this to a degree, but it's about the everyday people whose lives are ripped apart by displacement. It is about the parents, the nurses, the kids, the teachers, the fathers, the mothers. It's the fact that this impacts so many people that and there, for the grace of God, goes I. It could just so easily be me. It could be my family. It could be my kids. And at the end of the day, to me, that's what it kind of means. We're not really strangers. We may choose not to necessarily acknowledge that, but we're not really strangers.
Yeah, such a shared experience and a sense of sort of deep kind of human connection at some of them. It's like at a profound, almost molecular level. And I feel that. Of course, many times where I have visited field operations, there is not a language that I might have in common with someone who's been displaced. And I'm always amazed. My teenage daughters are like, well, how do you talk with these people? Or how do you sort of do this communication? And yes, you can have a translator, and then you can also just communicate through body language and through eye contact and through a real sort of like sympathetic posture as you begin to listen to somebody's story. And that, I think, also gets at this sort of notion of not really strangers. We're not really that disconnected.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because people, I think I've lived in 9 countries, something like that. And people always say, it must be very different. How do you manage all the different cultures, all the different differences? And one of the things that's become clear to me, the older I get, is actually it's not the differences that define us, it's the commonalities, the things we have in common. And 95% of what we have and what we appreciate and what we value as individuals are the same. We all want to be thanked, we all want to be appreciated, we all want to be loved, we all want to be treated with kindness, we all want to be listened to. It's a smile is a smile, a tear is a tear. A hug is a hug. Yeah, okay, it may not be as appropriate in certain places to hug, but at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and we're all living the same shared sense of journey and for our lives, and so much of what we have is the same. It really isn't about the differences.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. And that is a beautiful note on which to end with a final question. And we've known each other now, Colin, for maybe a little over 6 months, certainly throughout the recruitment process. But I don't think we've had a lot of opportunity to break bread together. So I love this notion. I love a shared meal. I love to cook for my family and friends. And I'm
Are you
thinking
a good
about.
cook?
I think I'm a good cook. I'm a better baker. My husband is super creative, so he is usually the chef who leads. But this notion of breaking bread together really can take us from being strangers to being connected. And so I have sort of a dream dinner party for you. And I just want to know if there's something you would serve, either from a favorite dish from your childhood, from all of your travels and life in Asia. Like, spread for me a little bit what's at your dream dinner party.
Oh, I don't know. That's a difficult question. I think I am having having lived in Asia for so many years. I kind of just love Asian food, and I spent some years living and working in Thailand, running a big manufacturing group in Thailand, and really got to love Thai food. And some kaprao pai, which is kind of chicken basil, would be with kai dao with an egg on the top.
Oh, always with the egg on the top.
Would be one of the things that I would love to serve at a dinner. And I'm not a great cook, but that would be a lot of fun. And
I love it.
And have some friends around the table and some good conversation would be a great way of spending some time. We should do that sometime.
I'm ready.
We should go for kaprao pai.
I'm ready. I have spent my own fair share of time in Thailand over the years when I was working on family planning and women's reproductive health. Thailand has this sort of incredible history of access to contraception and sort of real notion of families as healthy and wealthy and really investing in their own sort of livelihoods, if you will, into the future. So I love and know Thailand well. Thank you for that. And thank you for the conversation. Thank you for sharing, I think, some very unique observations about that simulation that you went through. Also a business perspective, not just from a global supply chain, but then you took it out about 30,000 feet and reminded us, sort of how much the private sector has at stake in sort of addressing both social development issues, but also humanitarian and emergency crises. And what a pleasure it is to have you serve as one of our governors here at USA for UNHCR.
The honor is mine. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. Your time is valuable, and it means a lot that you've chosen to spend it here. You can find today's show notes, including how to connect with today's guest, at unrefugees.org/notreallystrangers. That's unrefugees.org/notreallystrangers. While you're there, I hope you'll consider making a donation to the organization I lead, USA for UNHCR, to help us provide more support for refugees here in the US and around the world. If this episode was impactful, please take a moment to review the show and share the episode with a friend or family member. This small action will help us have a much bigger impact. Thanks so much. Don't be a stranger.